Every expectant mother knows that what she eats impacts her baby. And now research shows that is also true for our cows. Maternal consumption of ReaShure during late gestation had a positive effect on the in utero calf, setting her up for better health and potentially even higher milk production once she joins the milking string. Learn more at balchemanh.com/launch and launch your herd for life.
Welcome to the 2021 Florida Ruminant Nutrition Virtual Symposium. In this group of presentations, sponsored by Balchem, we're focusing on a practical guide to reaching net zero carbon emissions. These recorded presentations will serve as the background and basis for our live discussion on Thursday, May 13th, 2021. This presentation focuses on the impact of animal diets and nutrition can have on carbon emissions. Dr. Juan Tricarico is the Vice President for Sustainability Research at the Dairy Management, Inc. and the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy. He interprets, coordinates, and commissions science to answer questions about the environmental responsibility of U.S. dairy farming and its contribution to global sustainable food systems. Dr. Tricarico received his licentiate degree in biological sciences with a minor in molecular biology from the Universidad CAECE in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and a doctoral degree in animal sciences from the University of Kentucky, where he currently serves as an adjunct professor in the Department of Animal and Food Sciences. Dr. Tricarico, the floor is now yours.
So thank you so much. I want to thank Balchem and also the Florida Ruminant Nutrition Symposium for this opportunity to be with you today. The topic that I'm going to discuss today relates to enteric methane emissions and mitigation of enteric methane emissions. This is a very broad topic, and so what I've decided to do today is to actually narrow it down to one of the areas that is getting the most attention these days, which is the use of feed additives as mitigants for enteric methane emissions. This is a topic that it's obviously only a subset within the broad topic of enteric methane emissions in dairy cattle. But as I said, is one that's moving fairly rapidly lately and is getting a lot of attention, not only in research, but also in media and by the industry. So I am going to share information that it's based on a scientific review article that was published not too long ago, and I do want to recognize the co-authors here for that paper, as you see in this first slide. I'm going to share here an agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about the study objectives. I'm going to also spend quite a bit of time talking about some of the considerations for feed additive evaluation. I think that this is a very important element that is actually not discussed in the article at all, but it's an element that it's very important for the type of work that I do when I work with the entire supply chain to help them understand, how to evaluate and then select eventually, mitigation practices that are most adequate to meet their objectives. We're going to spend some time on those considerations. Those refer to mode of action. There's quite a lot of discussion that's going to take place relative to efficacy. And then there's going to be a little bit of discussion as well on safety considerations. And then I will share a summary and conclusions. And then I want to end up the presentation with the most common question I get, so that you can get an idea of what people are basically asking, particularly those that are outside of the academic circles. So with that, first of all, I'd like to show a link here to say that this is the scientific article that I'm basing a lot of the work that I'm going to be showing here. There's the DOI, so it's something that you can go and very easily get. It's an open access journal article, so everybody should have access to it. The objective of this particular article was to summarize in vivo test results of feed additives that are currently available, or some that are actually in development, that can potentially reduce enteric methane emissions, and we included both beef and dairy. For our purposes here, it's important to look at all the data that's available, and even though we are when at least I am working particularly in dairy science, you know, the elements for beef are very relevant. So it's good to have that information. And like I said here, the focus on this particular review was on mode of action, efficacy, and safety, and we're going to talk about those things. I'm going to spend a bit of time here in this slide. These are considerations for evaluating the feed additives, and these are critical. These considerations are critical for development and marketing of these materials, you know, whatever they end up being. And so, first of all, let's talk about, you know, I'm going to talk about the three that the paper discusses, but I want to point out that there are a couple of other considerations, the two that you see at the bottom of the screen, that the particular article didn't really look at in full or examine in full. But you know, these are important ones that need to be considered as well. We'll touch them for a minute here before I leave this slide. So we start with mode of action, which basically is the mechanism by which the inhibition or the mitigation, in fact, is occurring. In some instances, it is inhibition. In some instances, it's not. In some instances, is modification of the ruminal environment or changes in that environment that lead the fermentation process away from methane formation. I found out that in recent discussions that actually the terms that scientists use, rumen modifier, is something that is not necessarily well received in some of the other circles. The term modifier seems to get people nervous. So I think we're probably you're gonna see at least me changing from this language to other types of language that basically describes that what we're trying to do is, with any of these feed additives, is to direct fermentation away from methane formation. The next one is effectiveness or efficacy, and this one is important because it is the crux of the matter here. Is the additive actually accomplishing its intended function? And the function here is to reduce or mitigate methane emissions. And that this intended function is in fact occurring under the conditions of use. You see the terms, I highlighted here the terms conditions of use. This is very important because products may have multiple functions, and it depends on how they are used that those intended functions are met or not. So these conditions of use include things such as effective dose, the magnitude of the reduction, by how much it reduces emissions, but also the variation associated to that magnitude. And then other elements like interactions with other feed ingredients. The third element is safety. And here it's important for me to identify a couple of things. First of all, that the safety consideration is also dependent on the conditions of use. Okay, so everything that we talk about in terms of effectiveness or efficacy also apply to safety in terms of the conditions of use. You know, something may be safe under conditions of use, but maybe actually not be safe with other conditions, right? So once again, it's important to understand the dosages and interactions when you're looking at safety. And then I want to highlight that safety has three primary elements. There's animal safety concerns. So that means, is this safe for the animals that are consuming the additives? There's a food safety concern as well. That means, is this safe for human beings that are later consuming food products derived from those animals? And then eventually there's also an element of environmental safety. In some instances, maybe the production or even the use, the distribution, the use of these additives may themselves present environmental concerns. Maybe if they themselves are pollutants and they could escape into the environment. Those are the three elements that the article discusses in more detail, and the ones that we're going to look at in more detail. As I said, the two other elements are important for development and marketing, and they're critical for the evaluation. And we won't touch too much on them, but it's important for us to keep in mind that they're absolutely essential. So anything that affects productivity, anything that affects, you know, milk production in this case, anything that affects the quality of the product, in our case, milk yield, milk composition, taste of the milk, shelf life of that milk, is going to be critical and essential for evaluation of a feed additive. There's also an element of profitability within the productivity and quality function here that is very important. Return on investment is something that needs to be examined as well. Obviously, this opens up a lot of discussions because profitability or return on investment will vary on a number of other types of considerations that are even outside of the biological elements, right? There's price components, there's business models components, there's financing, and all sorts of other creative elements that also need to come into consideration, like even carbon credits and such. We won't go into that discussion, but it's important to keep that in mind. And then there's this element of market accessibility that I'm referring to at the bottom of this slide. It refers to the availability of the additive. It refers to also things such as like the scalability. Is this something that can be scaled and something that can be used, wide scale throughout the world, throughout the U.S., throughout the world. There's other elements that are important for market accessibility, like ease of use. In some instances, some of these materials may require reformulation or may require some other elements, because they're not so easy to use, that bring barriers to adoption. So that also affects market accessibility. And then there are also finally some other elements like claims or certifications that are important to some actors within the industry that also should be considered when looking at market accessibility. So with that, let's go ahead and start talking about some of the details here. So we're going to get started with mode of action, and I'm not going to actually spend a lot of time on this slide. It's a pretty busy slide. The idea here is to show that there are two different types of categories in which feed additives could be thought of, right? Some additives are going to be direct inhibitors of the process, the biochemical pathways in which methane is produced or by which methane is produced, and others are actually going to be directing fermentation away from methane in a more indirect way. I'm referring to them, like I said, as ruminant modifiers. I probably will start changing my language, as I mentioned earlier already. But the point of the matter here is that you have some direct inhibitors and then some other feed additives that indirectly mitigate methane production. Okay, but there are a few things that are important to understand, and that is, first of all, that methane is in fact a significant sink and a disposal mechanism for preventing hydrogen accumulation in the rumen. And hydrogen accumulation, after a certain level, it starts disrupting the ruminal feed digestion process. So definitely not something that's desirable in the rumen, because it affects digestion of the entire diet eventually if it accumulates. The inhibitors that directly inhibit methane emissions usually disrupt the methane production pathways themselves. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next few slides. But things such as competitive hydrogen sinks, or for example, some that address specific enzymes, within the pathway that you see in the slide. But then the indirect feed additives are ones that influence the methane formation process because they change the rumen environment, right? One of the elements that I want to point out is that under both conditions, usually there is a requirement for redirection of hydrogen, okay? Because remember that once again, hydrogen is abundant in the rumen. We're talking about an environment where there is no oxygen or very limited amounts of oxygen. So it's a reductive environment. That means that hydrogen accumulates, right? And so when methanogenesis or in either way is restricted or inhibited, there is this need for alternative hydrogen sinks, which is shown here on the left-hand side of this diagram. And this is something that always needs to be, kept in mind. Under some circumstances, if hydrogen 2 is produced, the hydrogen gas could be actually directly released. In some instances, the hydrogen actually is used in biochemical pathways to create other reduced products of fermentation, such as propionate or butyrate. But at the end of the day, all of these elements, are interconnected elements that affect the entire process of digestion that occurs in the rumen, and some some cases, some of these changes, have wide impacts that we don't necessarily yet understand completely. And that's why I say here that, in many cases, it affects rumen metabolisms in various unknown ways. And that's particular of the ones that indirectly influence methane formation. So let's go to the next slide, and let's look at all of the additives that were examined. Here, what I'm listing are the additives for which, scientific in vivo data, was collected. And you see how they're classified between inhibitors and modifiers. We're going to talk about them from the perspective of mode of action now. And so we're going to start with inhibitors, which are 3 of them. The first one is 3-nitroxypropanol, branded as Vovair in the European Union. This is a particular inhibitor that was developed to target the last step of the pathway. So if we actually go back to this slide, we're talking about this very last step where an enzyme actually forms the methane molecule, right? And that enzyme is called methyl coenzyme M reductase. And 3-nitroxypropanol is basically an analog in a certain sense of methyl coenzyme M, which is the cofactor that reacts with the enzyme and is the methyl donor that gets reduced by adding another hydrogen atom basically into it, and to create methane, which is CH4. It is obviously highly specific, this particular additive, to the last step of methanogenesis, and the mode of action is very well described, up to the point where the stereochemical information is available. The shape and function and what occurs, and how that inhibition occurs, how it reacts with the nickel in the active side of MCR occurs, is described in the literature. The next one is the topic of halogens, and seaweed here is very important, because seaweed is one vehicle by which halogens can be incorporated into the diet of ruminants. And in the case of seaweeds, there's a group of seaweeds that accumulate bromoform, and bromoform, being the primary inhibitor in this particular group of seaweeds, is in itself a methane analog. So in the case of 3-NOP, we talk about an analog that is similar to methyl coenzyme M. In the case of halogens, we're talking about bromoform being an analog of methane. Okay, it's similar to methane. And in this particular case, the inhibition is a little bit different. What happens here is that bromoform is a competitive inhibitor for another enzyme, or another actually family of enzymes. There's a number of different enzymes. They're called methyl transferases, right? And these enzymes, if we go back to the pathway, occur at an earlier step, here, where this methyl needs to be transferred onto coenzyme M, so that methyl coenzyme M can exist and then eventually interact with methyl coenzyme M reductase. So it's a previous step, as I said, and it prevents that transfer. Okay, so it inhibits methanogenesis pathway as well. Okay, but because methyl transferases are also active in acetogenesis pathways, it can also potentially inhibit reductive acetogenesis. I do have to say that this is a pathway that is not very predominant in the rumen, for various reasons that I'm not going to discuss here today, but it's one that scientists have been hoping to improve within the rumen environment, because acetogenesis can be a potential hydrogen sink, and a desirable one, because it produces acetate as a result. So if you once again go back to the pathway, it would be taking a reverse direction in this pathway, and so making sure that you're actually producing acetate instead of breaking it down, right? And so as I said, once again, this is a desirable approach to disposing of hydrogen, but something that scientists have not really yet cracked in terms of making it happen to a greater extent in the rumen. The final one in the group of inhibitors is nitrate. And in the case of nitrate, we're talking about just simply a competitive hydrogen sink where nitrate, NO3, basically replaces carbon dioxide as the electron acceptor, right? And so itself, it's reduced sequentially to nitrate and eventually to ammonium. This one is non-specific, it's also dose dependent, and it follows a stoichiometric relationships. It depends how much nitrate is available, because nitrate itself is a substrate. So once again, final time I'm going to do this, I promise. If we go back to the pathway, then you're talking about, you know, replacing carbon dioxide basically in a certain sense over here with nitrate. You know, that's not necessarily exactly the case, but the point that I'm trying to make is that at the end of the day, with nitrate, it's nitrate, the compound that becomes the hydrogen acceptor and eventually gets converted into ammonium, which is also beneficial for the rumen. So let's talk about modifiers now in terms of modes of action and specificity. And you're gonna notice right off the bat that there's quite a bit of a difference between direct inhibitors and modifiers, in the sense that the modes of actions of direct inhibitors are much more very well known. And in the case of modifiers or indirect inhibitors, there's not that level of specificity, there's not that level of knowledge. So let's start with lipids. There's a number of modes of actions. You can read them right there. You know, there's just a simple replacement of carbohydrates. You know, lipids provide energy to the animal, but they're not fermented in the rumen. So that in itself is one of the ways in which it reduces enteric methane. There's also an element of inhibiting microbes, you know, protozoa and methanogens, particularly long chain fatty acids. That's also apparently involved. There's also an alternative hydrogen sink element with polyunsaturated fatty acids. And eventually an element of reduction of fiber digestion and shift to propionate. Once again, you know, all of these modes of actions are mode of actions that, you know, have been described in the literature. They you know, or have been proposed, I should say, you know, in the literature. But the reality is that they're all out there, but nobody really has solid evidence as to which one of these is more predominant, under which circumstance. And so there's still quite a bit of unknowns here. So it's as a result of that, it's non-specific and it affects ruminal metabolism in a more wide manner. The case of monensing is an interesting one because of the modifiers. It is an antimicrobial. So obviously in this particular case, the mode of action is very well understood. It's an antimicrobial, and in this case, it's actually a broad spectrum antimicrobial that also affects ruminal metabolism, you know, widely. Tannins, not so much. You know, we start getting into the territory of the largely misunderstood, or not well understood, not misunderstood, but I should say not well understood modes of actions. So we're talking about, you know, compounds here that there's evidence, for example, in the case of tannins, for reducing fiber digestion and the formation of hydrogen, and also some evidence for directly inhibiting methanogens. But, you know, unknown specificity, broad effects on ruminal digestion, and so on and so forth. As we keep on going down this list, you notice, you guys, probably everybody here has already read what the table says. Most of it is other ones: essential oils, saponin, biochars, flavonoids, probiotic. They're either some broad antimicrobial effects or effects that in terms of inhibiting digestion, but the reality is that the modes of actions are poorly understood and in some cases completely unknown. So that means that the specificity is also unknown, and that they're likely having broader effects in metabolism than some of the other ones that we talked about earlier. So why is the mode of action so important? And one of the reasons is that it is actually very valuable to establish conditions of use, because once you understand the mode of action, then it provides value, it provides information to identify the active ingredient or the active component or components. It helps scientists establish those response relationships. It helps understand the strength of the prediction of that expected magnitude, that expected response. It helps establish effective doses, particularly if multiple functions can be achieved with the same additive. It helps also understand repeatability of the response, the specificity of the response. In some cases, it allows us to anticipate adverse and synergistic effects, which there are many of. And then finally, establish recommendations for use under different conditions, and particularly in some conditions to avoid use, because it's not going to be as effective. So here, what I did in this slide is kind of a little bit, I was trying to be a little bit of a joker and be a little bit funny. I quoted myself, all of the above is more difficult and sometimes impossible without knowledge on the modes of actions. When you understand how it works, you're just simply more confident on what to expect. This is something that I've been saying for quite a while. That's the value of mode of action. So let's jump now to effectiveness and their conditions of use, okay? And so I'm going to share with you a slide here that shows a graph from the paper. And this particular graph, I'm going to explain it here so that everybody can follow it. The graph basically shows enteric methane mitigation expressed as reductions in grams per day from beef and dairy in vivo studies. So these values over here that are graphed are the mean difference of methane production in grams per day. You're going to notice that all of them, or most of them here, are negative, right? Well, all of them are in fact negative because it's a reduction, and so these differences are expected to be negative. Here on the left-hand side, you can see the additives. You can see the counts, which represents the number of treatments that were compared. You can see the minimum reduction and the maximum. And then you can see the mean difference. So for example, in the case of seaweed, the mean difference that is exemplified or illustrated by this dot over here equals to minus 103.6 grams per day. And then you can see the confidence intervals, which are represented by these error bars. So right now, immediately this graph shows you a couple of interesting outcomes or insights. First of all, that there's quite a wide range in mitigation efficacy as expressed by these mean differences, from high to low, okay, from 3 grams here in the case of saponins per day